I woke up on a cold Tuesday morning to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. I thought it was just my alarm, but when I grabbed it, the notifications nearly made my heart stop. My landlord was texting that my rent payment had bounced. My electric company emailed that my auto payment failed. My boss sent a short, cold message. Payroll hadn't gone through for the whole team because the account I managed was locked. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Maybe the bank app was just down for maintenance. But when I tried to log in, the red banner across the top of the screen made it clear. Account frozen. Please contact your branch immediately. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. All my money, all my savings, my emergency fund, even my inheritance was in that account. And now I couldn't touch a single dollar. I called the bank hotline. After being stuck in automated menus for 30 minutes, I finally reached a representative who sounded like she was reading straight from a script. "Sir, your account has been placed under review due to suspicious activity." I tried to stay calm. "What suspicious activity? There has been no suspicious activity. It is my account, my paycheck, my deposits." "Sir, you will need to speak with the compliance officer at your branch," she said in a monotone voice. She refused to tell me anything more. I dressed quickly, threw on the first clothes I found, and drove straight to the branch downtown. It was still early, but the parking lot was already filling up. I marched inside and went to the first open teller. "I need to see the branch manager immediately." The teller's smile faded slightly. She pointed toward the glass office at the back of the bank. Inside sat a tall man in a navy suit, perfectly combed hair, and a smug expression as he clicked through emails. When he finally called me in, he didn't even stand up. "Mr. Williams," he said, glancing briefly at the screen in front of him. "I'm Paul Anderson, branch manager. Please have a seat." His voice was calm, practiced, but carried that tone of someone who believed he was untouchable. "My account is frozen," I said firmly. "I need access to my funds today." His smile was thin. "Your account has been flagged for suspicious wire activity. It will remain restricted until our compliance review is completed. That could take weeks, possibly months." "Weeks?" I almost shouted. "That money isn't play money. It is my life. I have employees waiting for their paychecks. I have rent due. I have bills." Paul folded his hands on the desk, unbothered by my panic. "I understand your frustration, but the bank has full legal authority to freeze accounts to protect against fraud." His eyes flicked down at the papers on his desk. "We noticed several large deposits over the past 6 months from an estate. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said. "My grandfather passed away last year. He left me an inheritance. Every document is in order. Probate court cleared it. The bank already verified the transfer 2 months ago." Paul's lips twitched. "But the deposits are unusual. Combined with your recent transfers to vendors, it meets our criteria for review." I leaned forward in my chair. "Are you saying paying my staff and bills is suspicious activity?" He adjusted his tie. "I'm saying it is not for you to decide. It is for us to decide." The smugness in his tone made me want to tear the desk apart, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You cannot keep my money frozen indefinitely," I said. "My grandfather worked his whole life for that money. You have no right to hold it hostage." Paul's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You can file a dispute through our compliance department. They will investigate in due time. I assure you, if everything is in order, your funds will be released. Until then, your account remains frozen." My phone buzzed on the desk. Another message from my landlord, threatening eviction fees if payment wasn't processed by tonight. I held it up. "See this? This is what your freeze is causing. Real damage to real people." Paul leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "The bank's responsibility is to protect the institution from liability, not to protect you from inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" I repeated. "My employees cannot buy groceries, my rent is overdue, my credit score is about to collapse, and you call it an inconvenience." Paul finally looked me straight in the eye. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Mr. Williams. Fighting the bank never ends well for the customer. Cooperate with us, and maybe your money will be available sooner. Leave it alone and let the process work itself out. But push too hard, and you might find the review lasting longer than you expect." My blood boiled at his thinly veiled threat, but I bit back my words. I stood up slowly, sliding the chair back against the polished floor. "You think you're untouchable," I said quietly. "You think because you sit in this office behind glass that you hold all the power." Paul smirked. "Isn't that the truth?" He picked up a pen and began scribbling notes, already dismissing me from his attention as if I was nothing more than a nuisance. I walked out of the bank, shaking with anger. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap. Reality sank in. My money was gone, not stolen, but caged, locked away by the very institution that promised to protect it. My phone buzzed again and again, employees asking where their paychecks were, family members checking in, my landlord sending another warning. Every second felt like another brick closing in on me. The bank thought they had me trapped, thought they could bury me under policies and procedures until I broke, but they didn't know what I had found in my grandfather's old files after he died. He left me more than money. He left me records, letters, and secrets that the bank never expected me to uncover. And as I gripped my phone that morning, staring at the towering building behind me, I made a quiet promise. You froze my account, but soon I'll freeze yours. That was the moment I stopped being a victim and started setting the trap.
I drove home from the branch in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. The city streets blurred past me, but my mind was locked on one thought. Everything I had worked for was being strangled by a faceless institution that called itself my bank. I parked outside my small apartment and sat in the car for a long time. My phone kept buzzing on the seat beside me, each notification a reminder of the damage the freeze was causing. I finally opened the messages. My employees wanted answers. They had families to feed. One text said, "I cannot pay my rent this week." Another said, "My card declined at the grocery store." I promised them I would fix this, but I felt like a liar because I had no plan. I called the bank hotline again, hoping to reach someone above Paul Anderson, but after 40 minutes on hold, the same automated voice told me my case was under review. I slammed the phone down on the passenger seat and stared out the windshield, rage building inside me. How could they justify starving people while hiding behind policy? My grandfather's voice echoed in my head from years ago when he warned me never to trust banks too much. He said they smiled when you made deposits and turned cold when you needed the most. He had grown up in the Depression and carried a deep suspicion of institutions that claimed to protect people while feeding on them. I never thought I would understand until now. Later that evening, I visited my mother. She lived a few streets over in a modest house. She still kept many of my grandfather's things. She saw the look on my face the moment I stepped inside and poured me a cup of tea before I could even sit down. "They froze my account," I blurted out. Her eyes widened with fear. "All of it?" I nodded. "Payroll, rent, everything. They claim there is suspicious activity." She sat down heavily in the chair across from me. "Your grandfather always said this bank was crooked," she whispered. "He kept every receipt, every letter he ever got from them in case they tried something like this again." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She went to the back room and returned with an old tin box, dented and rusted at the corners. She set it on the table and pushed it toward me. Inside were stacks of letters from the bank dating back decades. Notices of policy changes, statements threatening foreclosure in the 1980s when Grandpa fell behind on payments even though he caught up the next month. He never threw anything away. I sifted through the yellowed papers, feeling a strange sense of connection to him. Then my mother handed me a thick folder. I found this in his desk after he passed. I did not know what to do with it, so I kept it safe. Inside were detailed notes written in his neat, careful handwriting, lists of meetings with bank officers, names, dates, amounts. He had highlighted certain entries in red ink with a single word beside them: fraud. My chest tightened as I read his words, describing how bank representatives pressured him to sign new agreements with higher interest rates and hidden fees, how they tried to repossess equipment he had already paid off, how he suspected signatures were being altered to extend their control. He wrote, "I may not live to fight them, but one day someone will have to stand up for what is ours." My throat went dry as I looked at my mother. He knew. He knew they would try again. She nodded. He told me more than once the bank would never stop until they had taken everything from us. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. This was bigger than a frozen account. This was a war that had been going on for decades, and now it had landed on me. The next morning, I drove back to my office to face my employees. They gathered in the break room, waiting for answers. I explained what happened, the freeze, the excuses, the delay. I promised them I would find a way to get their paychecks released, but I could see the doubt in their faces. One of them asked, "What if the bank never gives it back?" Another asked if we should look for other jobs. I swallowed hard and told them the truth. I do not know how long this will take, but I will not stop fighting until you are paid. My words sounded strong, but inside I felt weak. After the meeting, I sat alone in my office, staring at the folder my grandfather had left me. There were names of bank managers from decades past, some retired, some long gone. But one name caught my attention, repeated over and over: Anderson. The same last name as the smug manager I had faced yesterday? I searched online and confirmed my suspicion. Paul Anderson was the grandson of the man who nearly foreclosed on my grandfather 40 years ago. The blood in my veins burned hotter than fire. This was not just a bureaucratic freeze. This was a legacy of harassment passed down from one generation to the next. My phone rang, breaking my thoughts. It was Mrs. Dalton, my grandfather's old neighbor. She sounded upset. "I heard what happened with your account," she said, her voice trembling. "They did the same to my brother last year. He lost his business because of it. The bank froze everything and bled him dry with fees until he closed his doors." I gripped the phone tighter. "How many others has this happened to?" "Too many," she said bitterly. "They prey on people who cannot fight back. The bank calls it compliance, but we all know it is theft." I thanked her for telling me and hung up, my resolve hardening. If this bank thought they could silence me with paperwork, they were wrong. Later that afternoon, a thick envelope arrived by courier. It was from the bank. Inside was a letter, written in cold legal language, informing me that not only was my account frozen, but any attempt to withdraw or transfer funds would be considered a violation, subject to further penalties. They demanded explanations for every deposit and threatened to close my account permanently if I did not comply. I read the letter twice, then crumpled it in my hand. The arrogance was staggering. They thought they could scare me into submission like they had done to others, but they underestimated me. I spent the evening spreading my grandfather's papers across the kitchen table, studying every detail. He had documented patterns of behavior, repeated for decades, fees invented out of thin air, false signatures on loan extensions, properties repossessed on technicalities. I realized this was not incompetence, it was strategy. A deliberate system designed to bleed people and trap them in endless cycles of debt. They froze my account, but I was beginning to see the cracks in their armor. They had left behind trails of paperwork, evidence of manipulation and fraud. If I could prove it, I would have more than just my money back. I would have a weapon. The following day, I returned to the branch, not to argue, not to beg, but to watch. I sat in my car across the street with a notebook, observing the flow of customers. Some walked out smiling with deposits made, but others stormed out furious, waving papers or talking angrily on their phones. I saw a pattern. Younger professionals moved through quickly, but older clients left frustrated and defeated. It was the same strategy I had read in my grandfather's notes: target the vulnerable, trap them in fine print, strip them of their savings. My anger turned to clarity. The bank had frozen me because I had become inconvenient. They wanted to control not just my inheritance, but my future. I whispered to myself, "You started this, but I'm going to finish it." What I did not know yet was how far the bank was willing to go to protect its secrets, and how deep my grandfather's trail of evidence really ran. I woke the next morning with my head still heavy from the weight of everything I had read in my grandfather's notes the night before. The papers were still spread across my kitchen table, as if he had left them there for me to find at the exact moment I would need them. I sat down with a cup of coffee and went through them again, line by line, looking for anything I had missed. The handwriting was meticulous. Dates circled in red,
amounts underlined with sharp strokes, names written in all caps, as if to make sure no one could ever forget who had wronged him. One note stood out more than the others. It described a meeting in 1981 with a bank officer who pressured him into signing new loan terms, even though the original loan had already been satisfied. Grandpa had written, refused to sign, suspect forgery, attempted intimidation, filed complaint. Nothing happened. I leaned back in my chair, realizing that decades later, I was staring at the exact same tactics, dressed in newer clothes. The bank had not changed. It had only learned how to hide better. I grabbed my notebook and began writing down connections between names from then and names from now. I saw a web forming. Families tied to the bank, generation after generation, just like Paul Anderson following in his grandfather's footsteps. It was not incompetence. It was inheritance. The sins of the past carried forward with new suits and polished shoes. By midday, I decided to take my search further. I drove downtown to the county records office. The building was dusty and crowded with shelves of old files. The clerk gave me a tired look when I asked for property and banking disputes involving Meadowbrook Bank. But when I explained I was an heir investigating potential fraud, she shrugged and waved me toward a back corner stacked with heavy boxes. I spent hours digging through them, and what I found made my stomach churn. Case after case. Homeowners losing property over technicalities. Small business owners bankrupted by sudden freezes. Elderly widows stripped of savings through paperwork they never fully understood. Every file ended the same way. Dismissed or settled quietly, with the bank always walking away richer. I photographed every page that seemed relevant until my phone battery nearly died. While I packed up, the clerk leaned closer and whispered, "You are not the first one to ask about them, but you might be the first one who does not give up." I asked what she meant. She shook her head nervously and said, "Just be careful." Before walking away, her warning hung heavy in the air. I drove back to my apartment and found another envelope waiting at the door, this one stamped urgent. When I opened it, my anger nearly blinded me. The bank was now demanding detailed records of my inheritance transfers, copies of the will, probate documents, explanations for every check I had deposited. They threatened permanent account closure if I failed to comply within 10 days. I crushed the letter in my fist. But then I remembered something my grandfather had written. They will bury you in paperwork until you drown unless you learn how to swim faster than they expect. I spread the letters out again, late into the night, until I noticed something odd. An old check stub from the 1990s had the same authorization signature as the document freezing my account yesterday. The handwriting looked identical, almost as if it had been copied through a template. I pulled out a magnifying glass and compared them stroke by stroke. My heart pounded. It was not just a similarity, it was a replication. The same signature used across decades by different officers. That was not coincidence, it was fraud, pure and simple. I needed proof stronger than my own suspicion, so I decided to visit someone who might help. The next morning, I drove across town to the office of Walter Green, an old friend of my grandfather's and a retired lawyer. He had once handled property disputes, and though he was well into his 70s, his mind was still sharp. I explained everything and showed him the documents. He adjusted his glasses, studied the signatures, and shook his head slowly. "I knew they were crooked," he said, "but this is worse than I thought. These signatures are not authentic, they are forged. The problem is, proving it in court requires expert testimony, and the bank will fight like hell to bury it." I asked him what I should do. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Gather everything, not just signatures, but patterns, dates, transfers, anything that shows intent. Once you have enough, the regulators will have no choice but to act." He paused and added, "But be ready, they will come after you harder than you can imagine." That afternoon, I went back to the branch pretending to be just another frustrated customer. But this time I watched carefully. I saw Paul Anderson speaking quietly to a security guard, pointing toward me, then smirking as if I was entertainment. I walked up to the counter and asked again when my funds would be released. The teller gave the same rehearsed response, "Under review," but her eyes flicked nervously toward Paul before she spoke. I realized then that fear ruled this place. Everyone operated under his gaze, and those who crossed him paid the price. On my way out, a man in a cheap suit brushed past me, slipping a small folded paper into my pocket. I froze for a moment, then hurried outside before opening it. Written in rushed handwriting were the words, "Call me," with a phone number. I dialed it from a payphone downtown later that evening. A tired voice answered quickly. "Do not say my name," he whispered. "I work inside the bank. I know what they are doing to you and others. They're falsifying compliance reports, using automated flags to trap accounts, then draining them with fees until people give up." I asked him why he was helping me. He sighed. "Because I saw your grandfather fight them and lose, and I don't want to see it happen again. Meet me tomorrow night by the library parking lot. We can't talk on the phone. It's not safe." Before I could respond, he hung up, leaving me gripping the receiver with my pulse racing. When I got home, my phone buzzed with a new text. "Unknown number. Stop digging, or it will cost you more than money." I stared at the screen, anger rising in my chest. The bank thought threats would break me, but they only confirmed what I already knew. I was close to the truth. That night, I could not sleep. I paced my apartment, going over everything again and again. The forged signatures, the frightened clerk at the records office, the secret insider inside the bank, my grandfather's meticulous notes. All of it pointed to a machine built to exploit people while hiding behind law and policy. I stood by the window looking out at the city lights and whispered to myself, "They froze my account, but I'm about to freeze their entire empire." Tomorrow, I would meet the insider. Tomorrow, I would take the fight further than my grandfather ever could. Tomorrow, the trap would begin to close.
The next day felt heavier than any before it, as if the air itself carried the weight of what was about to unfold. I went to work in the morning, pretending to keep things normal, but my mind never left the thought of the meeting at the library. Every hour crawled by until the sun finally began to set. I drove to the old stone library that stood on the edge of downtown, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a single car tucked away in the far corner. I pulled up beside it and a man stepped out, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. He glanced around nervously before speaking. "You came?" His voice was low and tight. I nodded. "You said you work at the bank." He looked over his shoulder as if even the shadows could be listening. "I do, but not for much longer. I have seen what they are doing to you. It is the same playbook they use on dozens of customers every year. They call it compliance review, but really it is a cash trap. They freeze accounts on vague suspicion, then drain them with fees until people are too broken to fight back. By the time the account is released, the money is gone." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "And the forged signatures?" He exhaled slowly. "I thought no one else noticed." "Yes, they use the same authorization templates over and over to approve things they were never legally allowed to approve. I have seen them recycle signatures of retired officers. They keep the image files in their system." My heart pounded. "Can you prove it?" He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. "Everything is on here. Internal emails, compliance reports, altered signatures. Enough to expose them if you are brave enough to use it." I closed my hand around the drive like it was gold. "Why are you giving this to me?" He hesitated. "Because your grandfather once came to me when I was a junior clerk. He told me he knew what they were doing. He told me to be careful. I never forgot his words. Now, it is my turn." Before I could thank him, headlights turned into the lot. He froze. "Go now," he hissed. "Do not call me. Do not look for me. Just use the evidence." He ran back to his car and drove off, leaving me standing alone with the flash drive burning in my palm. The headlights belonged to a security patrol circling the lot. I quickly slipped the drive into my pocket and walked calmly to my car, pretending nothing was unusual. But my pulse thundered in my ears. Back home, I plugged the drive into my laptop, my hands trembling as I opened the files. What I found made my stomach turn. Dozens of emails between executives discussing account freezes as revenue strategies, charts showing profit margins tied directly to the number of accounts under review, memos instructing managers to target estates, inheritances, and retirement accounts because those customers were less likely to fight back quickly. And there, in plain sight, templates of authorization signatures, copied and pasted across years of documents. The evidence was undeniable.
I spent the night organizing the files into folders, creating backups on hidden drives, and printing copies to hide with my mother in case anything happened to me. By dawn, I knew I had enough to bring them down, but I also knew they would not go quietly. Later that day, another letter arrived from the bank, this one more aggressive than the last. They accused me of attempting to interfere with an internal investigation and warned that continued resistance could result in permanent seizure of my assets. The arrogance was staggering, but it also told me one thing. They were scared. I called Walter Green, the retired lawyer, and told him what I had found. When he saw the files, his face went pale. "This is not just civil fraud," he whispered. "This is criminal. We need to file for an injunction immediately to prevent them from touching a single cent more, and we need to get this to federal regulators before it disappears." I asked if he thought we had a chance. He leaned forward, eyes sharp, despite his age. "With this much evidence, we have more than a chance. We have the match to light the fire." That afternoon, we went to the courthouse to file the emergency injunction. The clerk looked startled as she read the complaint, especially when she saw the list of exhibits. Within hours, a judge signed the order, freezing not my account, but the bank's ability to process any further internal transfers from it. The trap had officially begun to close. When Paul Anderson found out, he stormed into my office the next morning, his face red with fury. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he shouted. I stayed calm. "The injunction is legal and binding. You froze me, now I froze you." His hands shook as he leaned across my desk. "You will regret this. People bigger than me want this buried. Walk away now and maybe you still get to keep something." I stared back at him, refusing to flinch. "My grandfather taught me never to sell my soul for convenience. I am not walking away." For a moment, I thought he might actually hit me, but instead he straightened his suit, forced a smile, and said softly, "Then you have no idea what is coming," before slamming the door behind him. As his footsteps faded, I looked at the flash drive still plugged into my laptop and whispered, "You have no idea either." The bank had drawn first blood, but now the balance was shifting. The evidence was in my hands, the courts had started to listen, and soon the world would know the truth. The fight was no longer about just my frozen account. It was about every person they had ever crushed under their so-called compliance reviews. I knew they would strike back harder than ever, but for the first time since this began, I felt something new stirring inside me.
The day of the confrontation arrived sooner than I expected. The courthouse had scheduled an emergency hearing after the judge reviewed the injunction and realized the scale of the evidence. Walter told me to be ready for anything because the bank would send their sharpest lawyers to tear me apart. I walked into the courtroom with my folder of documents and the flash drive clutched like a weapon. The room smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of place where battles were fought not with fists, but with words and paper. On the opposite side sat Paul Anderson, flanked by two expensive-looking attorneys in tailored suits. They glanced at me with smug confidence, as if they had already won. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. Walter opened by presenting the forged signatures side by side with the originals. He explained how the same authorization had been recycled for decades, and how that same signature had been used to freeze my account without legal authority. The judge leaned forward, studying the papers with growing concern. One of the bank's attorneys stood and tried to argue the signatures were coincidental, but Walter pressed a button on the projector. The screen lit up with internal emails from the flash drive. Words appeared in bold for everyone to see. Ensure account freeze matches compliant signature file. Maintain revenue quota. Target inheritance accounts. A ripple of shock spread through the small crowd of reporters and community members seated in the back. The judge's gavel struck the bench for silence, but the damage was done. Paul shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his smug smile gone. I stood and took my turn to speak. "Your Honor, this is not just about me. My account was frozen without cause, but look at these reports. Hundreds of customers targeted with the same tactics.
Families drained of savings, small businesses destroyed, inheritances stolen under the guise of compliance. The bank calls it procedure, but it is extortion. The bank's second attorney jumped up, objecting that I was making accusations without foundation, but Walter calmly handed the judge another folder. Inside were financial charts showing profits spiking in exact proportion to the number of accounts under review. It was undeniable. The judge turned to the attorneys and asked sternly if they wished to explain how such documents existed inside their institution. They fumbled for words while Paul's face grew paler by the second. That was the moment I revealed the final twist. I pulled out a deed my grandfather had left in his files and placed it on the evidence table. Your Honor, this deed shows that the very building this branch operates in was acquired using falsified signatures identical to the ones you see here. This bank is literally built on fraud. The courtroom went silent. Even the reporters stopped scribbling for a moment as the weight of the words sank in. The judge cleared his throat and announced the hearing would be adjourned pending federal review. He ordered the bank to unfreeze my account immediately and barred them from closing it until the investigation was complete. Paul's lawyers protested, but the gavel came down again, silencing them. As the room emptied, reporters rushed forward, firing questions, but I kept my eyes locked on Paul. He glared at me with a look that could kill and muttered, "You have no idea what you've started." I leaned closer, just enough for him to hear. "You are right. I have started the end of you." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and microphones shoved in my face. I spoke only one sentence: "The truth always wins eventually." That night, I sat in my apartment with Walter and my mother, the flash drive plugged into my laptop, showing document after document. We had barely scratched the surface of what it contained. There were connections to city officials, regulators, even local politicians who had quietly benefited from the bank's schemes. Walter rubbed his temples and said, "This is bigger than any of us thought. The FBI will be all over this by morning." My phone buzzed with another unknown number. The message read simply, "Leave town now." I showed it to Walter, who only nodded grimly. "That means they know they're losing. Hold steady." My mother placed her hand on mine. "Your grandfather would be proud. He fought them his whole life, but never had the proof. Now you do." I thought of him sitting late at night with his notebooks, writing every detail while the bank tried to crush him. His fight had become my fight, and now his voice echoed inside me like armor. They froze my account to silence me, but tonight I had silenced them. Tomorrow, the real war would begin.
The morning after the hearing, the storm truly began. News vans lined the street outside my apartment, their antennas stretching toward the sky as if hungry for every scrap of the story. Reporters shouted questions as I left for the courthouse again, but I kept my head down, clutching the folder of evidence tighter than ever. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a small dispute between a customer and a bank. This was a reckoning. Federal investigators sat in the back rows, taking notes while the judge called the session to order. The bank's attorneys looked tired, their polished confidence beginning to crack. Paul Anderson sat between them, his face pale, his hands fidgeting with a pen that clicked over and over until one of his lawyers hissed at him to stop. Walter stood and presented the final set of documents from the flash drive, emails directly linking Paul to the compliance freezes. One message bore his signature, approving quotas for how many accounts should be locked each month. The judge read silently, then lifted his eyes, cold and sharp. "Mr. Anderson, would you care to explain why your name appears on these directives?" Paul tried to answer, but his voice cracked. One of the attorneys stepped in, insisting the documents were fabricated. But before the words could even settle, the door at the back opened and the whistleblower walked in, escorted by 2 federal agents. The courtroom gasped. The judge allowed him to speak. He identified himself as a compliance officer for the bank and testified under oath that the documents were genuine. He had watched signatures recycled and policies weaponized to drain customers of their funds.
He said he came forward because he remembered my grandfather's fight and could not stay silent any longer. The room erupted. The judge struck the gavel, but not before every reporter had already captured the moment. Paul's lawyers tried to object, but the damage was beyond repair. The judge ordered a full federal audit of the bank effective immediately and granted me unrestricted access to my funds. He went further, suspending several of the bank's executives pending investigation. Paul's shoulders slumped as the agent stepped forward. He was not in handcuffs yet, but his empire was crumbling. As the session ended, I walked past him slowly and whispered the words he had once thrown at me. "You have no idea what you started." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters begged for statements, but I spoke only the truth. This is not just about me. This is about every person who ever lost their savings to hidden fees, every business destroyed by freezes, every family broken by greed. Today the bank was caught, but tomorrow others will be. The people cheered, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to relief. Days turned into weeks as the investigation spread wider. Executives resigned one after another. Accounts were unfrozen for dozens of families. Businesses that had been strangled finally breathed again. Walter helped me file a civil suit, not just for myself, but as part of a class action on behalf of everyone harmed. The bank tried to settle quietly with large checks and confidentiality agreements, but people had seen too much. They wanted justice, not hush money. 6 months later, the bank's name was synonymous with corruption. Federal charges loomed over its leaders. Regulators promised reforms to protect customers from ever facing the same traps again. Paul Anderson disappeared from public view, but whispers of indictments followed him everywhere. One evening, I sat with my mother on her porch. The summer air warm, the sound of cicadas filling the silence. She poured me a glass of lemonade and looked out toward the horizon. "Your grandfather would have been proud," she said softly. "He fought them with everything he had, but it was you who finally broke their chains." I thought of his notes, the neat handwriting, the careful records, the warnings written in red ink. He had prepared me for this fight without me even knowing it. I raised my glass toward the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." The next day, I walked past the bank branch that had once held my life hostage. The windows were dark, the doors chained shut, a notice taped across the glass, "Closed by order of federal investigation." People gathered outside, shaking their heads, some smiling, some crying. Across the street, a new sign was being raised above a smaller building, Meadowbrook Community Credit Union, opening soon. A place built not on greed, but on trust. As I stood there, a little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked why the big bank was closed. She bent down and said, "Because they were stealing from people, and someone finally stopped them." The boy looked at me curiously, then smiled. I smiled back and walked away, my steps lighter than they had been in months. They froze my account, but in the end, I had frozen their empire. And with that, the cycle my grandfather had warned me about was finally broken.